The story of Radio 270. Now, 1 million men died on the Western Front during the First World War, men like those listed here. But a few refused to go to war because they believed it was unjust. At the time, their story was hushed up, but now Sophie Hull has unearthed the truth.
The history books are agreed that World War I was, at least at the beginning, a popular cause. But take a closer look at one Pennine town where the textile mills were booming and the workers had a history of political debate, and you'll find a different story.
In Huddersfield, there was an influential number of conscientious objectors, men who fought hard to not go to war. Recorded history tells us people like this were a small and marginal minority, that they met with jeers and abuse in public and were presented with white feathers as a symbol of their cowardice.
It's what we call them yellow bellies.
Arthur Barraclough willingly volunteered to go and fight for his country. He signed up in Bradford as a teenager.
I was proud to be an Englishman. If you played football or rugby, you were a sportsman. And if anything like this come, you'd go with any argument. But if you were a yellow belly, they'd do anything to get out of it.
But getting out of it wasn't an option in 1916 when conscription was introduced for the first time. The war was longer and bloodier than anyone had thought possible, and more men were needed on the front line. Tribunals were set up around the country to hear reasons why some were unwilling or unable to go and fight. Decades later, Cyril Pearce, a Leeds University lecturer, uncovered a transcript of an extraordinary tribunal hearing in Huddersfield that baffled the authorities. This is what happened.
In March 1916, one of the key figures in the war resistance movement in Huddersfield, Arthur Gardner, came to the Military Service Tribunal to argue his case for exemption from military service. And the town hall was packed. And remember, this tribunal experience was absolutely brand new in British history. Never happened before. There'd never been conscription in Britain before, therefore there'd never been any reason to establish tribunals to adjudicate on people's conscientious objection to it. So here's a bunch of people, all well-meaning in their own way, drawn from the local council, with the mayor as chair of the tribunal, Alderman Blamires, other representatives from the council, and the military authorities too. All amateurs, brand new to what was in fact a novel occasion, but nobody had given them a script. They didn't know exactly how to deal with it.
Ladies and gentlemen, order. If this continues, I'm going to have to clear the court and hear this case in private.
Here's this guy who was well known in the town as being politically radical, against the war, an energetic, intelligent presence who has clearly got a charisma overload here.
Look, perhaps I can account for the applause, because I've adopted an anti-war attitude in times of peace, as well as war.
Seeing a tribunal, it overawes most people. Well, Dad wasn't like that. He was used to speaking. He was able to express himself, and he had quite a sharp mind. So it prepared what he was going to say, and perhaps some of the others hadn't thought it through thoroughly. And the tribunal were rather taken aback by this.
You are against militarism, but surely that's no reason why you should not fight for your country.
I have no country. I realise that the interests of the workers of Germany are identical to those of the workers of England. And for that reason, I cannot march against them. And I will not.
His case was one that the people on the tribunal had never heard before. For them, the typical conscientious objector would be a Quaker with, if you like, ethical objections to killing people. Arthur came in with a totally different set of arguments. For him, he had more in common with working men and women, France, Germany, throughout Europe, than he had with the people in Westminster who were telling him he ought to be fighting.
Such curious ideas.
I believe Mr. Gardner's made a splendid case.
On the contrary, sir, I believe he's talking through his hat.
Along came Arthur, And after him, over the following months, a whole succession of others who said it's a capitalist war which has nothing to do with the working class. War is a gun with a worker at each end. And they weren't prepared to be at either end of the gun, and certainly not prepared to pull the trigger.
The tribunal has come to a decision with great difficulty. By a majority, however, we find that the applicant is entitled to call himself a conscientious objector. We are therefore disposed to grant to Mr. Gardner temporary exemption for 2 months. At the end of this period, he may consider a further appeal.
His appeal was rejected, and Arthur was drafted into the army with 5 other prisoners.
Here at Huddersfield Station, the prisoners were given a rousing send-off by scores of sympathisers who packed the platform. The red flag was sung, and people cheered for the conscientious objectors as the train pulled away.
The men were treated like heroes in their hometown, but in the eyes of the authorities, they were no more than criminals.
While conscientious objectors may have experienced a degree of tolerance in Huddersfield, inevitably the law caught up with most of them, and they were imprisoned in places like this. Richmond Castle.
A group known as the Richmond 16 were held here for their refusal to fight. They were eventually taken to an army camp in northern France, but left their mark in the form of graffiti, which was discovered more than 50 years later. Bert Brocklesby's family recall how he was prepared to die rather than join up.
He did make the point, and I heard him say this, he said, if you think of Christ, he was a conscientious objector, he preached peace and turning the other cheek, and yet he has had more long-term influence on the world than Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan put together. You can call them misguided and say that they're foolish. They were prepared to die for their beliefs.
After the war, many of the conscientious objectors did have difficulty being accepted by their communities again. But the fate of Arthur Gardner perhaps best summed up Huddersfield's tolerant view, when years later they made him mayor of the town.
A war story about men who showed a different kind of bravery. EastEnders is next, but right now you can join Radio 270 DJ.